Multicam video setups are often super practical for a whole bunch of different projects. Even in most of my normal YouTube videos, I have at least 2 cameras, usually a main shot like this, and a secondary angle like this, and then sometimes even a 3rd or 4th angle to show additional close-ups and, help communicate things more clearly to the audience. But working with multiple cameras can also get very complicated and very expensive very quickly. My main cameras are Sony full-frame mirrorless cameras, and while I love them and they're fantastic, they are super expensive. It does take a lot of time and effort to learn how to use them properly, and then when you're done recording, if you're recording internally, then you have to sync up all the footage and kind of make it match, and the workflow, there's a lot to the workflow. Now, as a lifelong camera nerd, I don't really mind that. I love that sort of thing, but that is absolutely not practical for everybody, especially when you factor in the cost. The camera that I'm using right now, the Sony FX3, costs over $4,000. The lens that I'm using, this 24mm lens, is a $1,500 lens. And then the second camera over here is a Sony a7S III. This is also almost a $4,000 camera. And I am actually using only a $300 lens on this one, which is just the 50mm lens that I like a lot. And then you add on top of that batteries and high-speed memory cards, and this is easily, just this 2-camera setup is easily over $10,000. So a while ago, EMEET reached out and offered to send 5 of their webcams for me to test out, 2 of the Pixy cams and then 3 of the Pixy wireless cameras. I had actually not used any EMEET cameras before, and so I did a bit of research, and I did notice that the reviews were surprisingly good, and even on Amazon they were like some of the best selling webcams around. I was just kind of out of the loop, I guess. So I've been playing around with these, testing these out a bit, and then they asked if I'd be interested in exploring some different multicam setups you could create with these, and I definitely was, especially because the thing that draws me to these more than anything is the affordability, which then ties directly into accessibility. So the basic camera I'm using today, the EMEET PIXY, is a 4K 30 webcam. This is an MSRP of $99. So you get a 4K PTZ tracking camera for $99. I found that very interesting. And honestly, I think it looks pretty fantastic. This is it right here. Now, it's not going to have the same shallow depth of field and cinematic qualities as my full frame mirrorless camera, but keeping in mind that this camera costs about the same as one of the batteries for my other cameras, it's actually pretty impressive. And what I really like about these cameras is that they have 2 cameras built inside. One of them is the actual image camera, that's what you're seeing right now, and the other one is a dedicated tracking camera. So if you want to take advantage of that PTZ functionality, which is very, very helpful, especially if you're a solo person trying to work with multiple cameras, having them, autonomously being able to track you is super helpful. The other camera is a dedicated tracking camera. So that just means even in low light conditions, it's really going to lock onto the subject and not lose it if it moves or the lighting changes or whatever. Now the Pixy wireless cameras did kind of blow my mind a little bit because they're sort of the same camera as this, but just with a built-in battery and wireless capabilities. They do have a different lens, so it's a wider field of view, but it is the same image sensor. But, a camera that can be used either through USB. It does have MicroSD for internal recording, and then also a built-in 8-hour battery and wireless connectivity. This is an MSRP of $199. If I switch back to the regular Pixy, this is this lens on the regular one, and then the wireless one has a pretty significantly wider field of view, but the image sensor, like I mentioned before, is exactly the same between them. But here's the getting this camera, $199, it is cheaper than one of the memory cards that I use in my other cameras, and each of my cameras needs 2 of these memory cards. So I just bring that up to keep our expectations reasonable, but also kind of highlight the insane cost effectiveness, especially if you want to dive into the world of multicam production. Because for a lot of podcast, video, streaming, and teaching type workflows, multiple cameras can really help level things up, not just from this is a fun kind of point of view, but in a really practical, making things clearer for your audience, for your viewer, for your clients kind of way. And making multicam accessible to someone who might not have a lot of experience with it, that is something that I think is really cool. Using multiple cameras can also be super practical in just helping things be more clear for your audience and for you when it comes to editing if you're not doing something that's streamed live. So my typical setup of using a camera like this and using a camera like this is kind of an editing trick. Typically what I'll do is I'll set up a main point here. I'll say, here's a thing to know stuff about. And then I'll go over to this camera that's kind of a little bit tighter and a little more zoomed in, and I will give more information about that thing. So it's like broad concept, specific point that I want you to remember. But it's also very helpful when it comes to editing, because I kind of know that then instead of having to use jump cuts, which doesn't always fit or can kind of be distracting sometimes, if I sort of mess up or I need to redo something, I can just switch over to my other camera and then use this instead, and it kind of becomes a little more seamless. Something I used to do a lot was actually just always stare at my main camera and then let this camera sort of be just a side angle, which is very helpful for editing, because if I'm talking here and I mess up, I can actually switch to this shot and sort of cover up a cut, but no one would actually know, and I don't have to be aware of that while I'm filming. I can do that all during editing. When I actually face the camera over here, internally, mentally, I'm kind of editing already and knowing I'm going to be using this shot here and I'm going to be using this shot here. So let's just two different ways that using just two cameras can really help your workflow. Now, as I've been experimenting with different setups using the EMEET cameras, I kind of can't help but notice some similarities to the OBSBot webcams and the OBSBot PTZ cameras that I used in the past. If you know me, you know I'm a huge fan of those cameras as well. And so my initial thought is, oh, how do these compare to those? But I kind of realized that they sort of go for different, totally different, markets, different customers. I think OBSBot cameras are much more production centric, especially if you get into their wireless cameras like the Tail Air and the Tail 2. The network connectivity, the physical remote controls, the difference in optics, those are geared more towards production workflows. Whereas the EMEET cameras, what I love about them is they do a really good job of keeping everything very plug and play, very, very simple. And again, that word I've used multiple times now, very, very accessible. So if you're somebody who has no background in production, but you just kind of want to do something that involves multiple cameras, or you need to do something that involves multiple cameras, you can, if you've ever plugged in a USB device, you're pretty much ready to go with these. And that's my goal today, is to share some practical multicam setups that you could use for podcasting, video recording, streaming, teaching, using both the wired Pixy webcams and the wireless webcams in sort of different capacities. So let's put that to the test now using what is basically the same camera setup that I use when I stream, which is a 2-camera setup with my main camera being over here, and then a second camera over here to kind of show, an overview of the whole setup, along with, if I need a close-up of something specific that I'm trying to show or talk about. Now, the first thing I've done with this setup is place the camera right at eye level. So even though the Pixy cameras do come with the standard mounts that let you put them on a monitor super easily and position them, which is, the quickest and most convenient way to do it, if you're able to position the camera at eye level, right away, that's going to make it not look like a webcam. As soon as you kind of see that sort of above the eye facing down angle, it just kind of looks like a webcam. And if you want to create something that looks a little more polished and professional with any camera, placing it right at eye level is a good way to get started. Now, the other thing you might notice is that I am using a separate microphone. So no matter what camera you use, if you can use a dedicated microphone, that is also going to level up the quality of whatever you're making just by a lot. Audio really is half, if not more than half, of the video experience. And I'm using the SM7B through the Rodecaster Duo right now, which is a very nice setup. But even a very simple USB microphone, or even a simple, wireless setup, like a cheap one, will work really, really well to help things sound their best. Now, these cameras do have built-in microphones. As you can hear right here, this is the Pixy's built-in microphone. But I'm not close to the camera. The microphone's very, very small. And so it's not ideal if you want to deliver the best experience. So that's why I think whether you're streaming, you're recording videos, or you're doing a podcast, having a dedicated microphone really is kind of a non-negotiable additional thing that you should have in your setup. And as we're going through this, do you notice how I'm cutting between these cameras? I'm over here to make some points, and then I'm also over here to make other points. And this is a pre-recorded video, of course, it's not a live stream, but that really helps my editing. And I am just recording this into OBS, which is a free app. So that way, you have your two $99 webcams. That's it in terms of cost. And so I have this scene, which is, this camera, the B camera, has its own scene where it's a source. This camera, the A camera, has its own scene where it's a source. I also have a scene where I just put both of them together just so you can see that they are perfectly in sync. Or if you were using these two cameras to film, two different people that you could do that and both shots would be in sync. And I do have hotkeys enabled in OBS for switching, so each scene is just kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that sort of thing. So I can use the number pad here. I can click on the scene that I want, or since I like to use these MMO mice that have buttons on the side, I can actually just use those side buttons to switch. But of course, you can then pair your scene switching to something else like a Stream Deck if you want to, you know, really streamline your stream. And here's kind of what that looks like in OBS. Just ignore the infinite window up here, but I have my scenes over here, and each scene just has one source for the most part, except for this all that has both the cameras. And then I have a scene recording OBS so you can see it. And then I also have a scene with EMEET Studio, just if I want to adjust the camera. So I can show you kind of a few things that I do have here. There is obviously tracking. And so if I go to this camera, what I can actually do, if I want to change something, I can zoom in, go all around over here if I need to. But because I did create a preset right here, if I click on that, the camera will just snap to that preset. And you can create several different presets if you need to. And then you do have your PTZ tracking right here. I can click tracking and now it is going to track me. So if I wanted this camera to track me, just ignore the mess behind me over there. And then I wanted this camera to just sort of be the steady camera and this camera to track me and move around with me. I can do that if I want to. And then if I don't want it to track anymore, I can go back to manual and I can click on my preset and now it's just going to go back to that preset position. I could also do something like create a zoom. So we are going to be using a digital zoom here. So if I go, you know, the maximum amount, you are going to see a little bit of pixelation. But if I zoom in at not the maximum amount, something maybe like this, that's when I can do something like, hey, look at this thing that I'm talking about right here. And then if you want a better close-up of it, I can cut to this shot here and we can talk about the stuff, which by the way, when it comes to tracking on these cameras, you can manually position them if you want to, but you just need to hold them there. So if I don't have tracking enabled, but I want to turn the camera or reposition it, I just need to turn it and hold it, and then it'll kind of stay there. This one's not powered on, but if you just move it, they won't stay there. But if you kind of turn it and hold it, it will then stay in that position manually. And just a couple other settings that I have in EMEET Studio. I have played with the exposure a little bit. I am using manual exposure in this case because I'm in an environment where the lighting isn't changing. If you're somewhere where you're not in control of the lighting, you're outside or you're by like a giant window and the lighting could change a lot, then using auto exposure might keep things simple. In this case, no matter what time of day it is, I can control the lighting in here, so I know it's going to be very consistent. And so that means in EMEET Studio, I went and turned on manual exposure, and then I just kept the gain at 22, and that kept the exposure at the level that I wanted. I'm also using manual white balance, so I've adjusted that a little bit. And for the most part, I've left the other image controls alone. And so this is, you know, pretty much the camera's default image, which especially once you position the camera where it needs to be, dial in the exposure, I think it looks pretty awesome. Again, remembering that this camera costs the same amount as the battery for the main cameras that I use. And I've done the same thing over here with this camera as well. I have the exposure set to manual. This is 26 on gain because it's sort of in a darker corner. It needed a little more so that they could match, but the white balance is the same and the other settings are pretty much the same. So they're not perfectly matched settings, but because of where the cameras are and the fact they have different lighting conditions, especially this one, it's much darker in the corner where this camera is located, then the gain didn't have to be exactly the same, but I can still cut between these and they match pretty well. Now the Pixys, just like a lot of PTZ cameras, do have gesture control. So especially if you want to like start tracking, you can hold up your hand. If you want to stop tracking, you can hold up your hand again. But you might have noticed I held up my hand and the camera did not start or stop tracking me. That is because in my case, I've gone into the settings and I've turned off gesture control. And this is not because I don't like that feature, but just because I'm somebody who talks with my hands a lot. And I've noticed during videos and streams and stuff, when I do that with PTZ cameras, I constantly enable and disable tracking and it gets a little bit distracting. So instead I turn off gesture control and then I just use the app to start or stop tracking when and if I want it. So it's just something to be aware of. If you're not someone who's talking with their hands a lot or it's not an issue, then being able to use those gesture controls is super convenient and kind of feels a little bit magical. But if you are somebody who, you know, does what I do and gesticulates while you talk, then you can turn off gesture controls and it makes things, you know, pretty easy. And as we're in EMEET Studio, I do want to point out this is the beta version of EMEET Studio 2. And the reason I'm using the beta version is because this all has more compatibility for the wireless Pixy cameras, and I want to be able to use the same software for everything. But we do have some basic, features here. We can even use a virtual cam. We can adjust the audio if we are using the built-in microphone. And then we can also go in and change our audio over here, noise canceling mode, original sound mode. We do also have some effects options. So beyond just what I showed for the image quality, we can even go into these beauty filters if we want to and, change some of the settings, change the way your skin looks if you want to. And then there is also this privacy tab right here, which if you do that, it's going to, disable the camera and also point it down so it can't see anything. Now, since this is beta software, there is something I would like to see added to it or adjusted in it, which is when we go into tracking and we turn on tracking, it works really well, and because it has a dedicated tracking camera, all of these cameras, one camera is for the camera and the other camera is for tracking. It does a great job of not losing the subject at all. But sometimes I found the tracking can be a little bit quick, and if you're just, talking and moving a little bit, you don't really need the camera to move fast. And so if there were something like a high, medium, and low tracking adjustment, I think that would be really helpful for all the different types of situations that you might be using these cameras and might be wanting to use the tracking feature. Now this setup right here, like I mentioned, this 2-camera setup is basically what I use for my live streams. It's also a great simple video recording setup. It would be great for something like an online class, especially where maybe this secondary camera, it could either zoom in on something you want to show, or you could have it mounted overhead as a top-down camera to show notes or class materials or something like that. This would be a very helpful setup for online teaching, which is something I really could have used when I was doing that full-time during the pandemic. But we don't have to stop here. So if we wanted to take things further, I kind of want to see what kind of multicam setup we can create using the wireless Pixy cameras. So now welcome to my 3-camera podcast setup using the Pixy wireless cameras. This is a setup that I've talked about before, but this is probably the simplest, most streamlined version of it. Typically, when you do a 3-camera podcast setup, what you have is a main shot or a master shot like this, where you kind of see everything. You see the whole setup, you see both people, and then you also have a dedicated camera for each person. So here's one for me as the host, and here's another one for the guest, which I don't have a guest today, so instead I'm going to invite Fuego the Firebird to sort of be a stand-in here, which would be a dream guest on an actual podcast. He is the mascot of our local AHL hockey team, but he's tough to book. I'm using the Hollyland Lark M2 wireless. This is a super cheap wireless system, and it has 2 transmitters, so I can have one on me, I can have one on my guest, and then I'm just running the receiver into the 3.5mm input of the main camera over here. The other 2 cameras, I have their audio muted because I don't want overlaying audio and echoing audio or anything like that. So this is the only camera recording audio, and then that's the same audio being used when I switch to the other cameras. For now, for this setup, I'm actually doing everything just via USB running into EMEET Studio. So this is an easy way to do 4K over USB. I've got my mouse right here. You can kind of see stuff on the computer back there a little bit, and I'm just switching between things that way. But of course, once you've got the cameras connected to your computer, you can use them in OBS, Ecamm, Riverside, whatever you need to select a camera in, you can do that as soon as they are connected. But this framing is a little bit strange because this is such a wide lens, but I'm using it as a guest camera, or in this case, a host camera. So typically in that situation, what I would do is zoom in like this a little bit, so that way it's just me, and then I can talk to the guests. So we want to leave plenty of look space over here. We don't want to have a bunch of dead space behind me. And then we would do the same thing with our guest's camera over here. So that way, those are kind of tight shots. And then we got the main shot over here. Right now, the way I'm recording, it's just recording whatever I'm switching to. So that's why I have my mouse right here. But if you're using Ecamm on a Mac, you do have the ability to do ISO recordings for your different cameras. So that means you can record your file, you can switch between cameras, but it'll also record the full footage from every camera at the same time if you want to go back into your editing software and sort of change some cuts or switch things around a little bit. I do believe there's also an ISO recording plugin for OBS if you're using that. I haven't experimented with that myself yet, but I've read a little bit about it and I've seen that I believe that's a possibility. So that's just something to keep in mind. But if you just want the simplest thing to do, just using EMEET Studio works because you can just set 4K recording, you can press record. In this case, the camera's doing auto exposure, auto white balance, and I'm just switching between them over there. And it's nice because then you also have your PTZ and tracking controls in the same software that you're using to record. It's also a good idea to consider using tracking on your individual shots like this, because imagine if I were the only one doing this and I wasn't having any help right now. That would be crazy, right? Imagine I had to set up all the cameras and figure all that stuff out, but then also have a conversation and host a thing that I'm trying to communicate information across. That would be a lot of multitasking for my brain that might tax it a little bit. So what we don't want to have happen is that if we're having a long conversation, 30 minutes, an hour, more than an hour, people kind of shift over time, right? And so imagine kind of leaning back, getting out of frame, and then you go to review your footage and you realize that you or the guest was leaning halfway out of the frame the whole time. So if you enable tracking, that means if something happens like that, an extreme movement, you don't have to worry about it because the camera will track you. And kind of a cool thing here, since I zoomed in on this shot a little bit, it's not going to track every movement that I make. So it's not going to be super distracting or make people motion sick. But if I were to make a big movement, then it's tracking me, because even though the camera's zoomed in, it's still seeing the full frame, and that's kind of what it's tracking. And the other thing to keep in mind is to make sure that the settings match across all your different cameras. So you don't want different frame rates and resolutions and colors and white balance and all that between them. You want to be able to switch between it and basically look like you just took the same camera and moved it into different spots, but you're actually switching between different cameras. But speaking of switching, this is all being recorded via USB into the computer, and I want to switch to a different way of recording your setup. So now I am in my 3D printing space. So if you watch my 3D printer videos, you might recognize this a little bit. I wanted to kind of switch the setup here, and this time I'm doing everything entirely wirelessly, which is good because if I switch to this shot here, this is kind of a smaller space. So you can see the main camera I've got here. I've got a camera back there, which is actually on the printers, so you can kind of see that here. And then I've got my main shot over here. So not having to run the wires and things works really well. I'm still doing my same audio that I was doing before. But that's basically it. So everything's being switched here, it's being recorded here, and then it's just saved directly to my camera roll. So I don't have to worry about exporting or anything like that. I can still go in and do tracking, PTZ, any of those kinds of features if I need to. So this is the way to basically do a wireless workflow. You know, you can have your multiple cameras, you can switch to all your different shots. There's nothing really static here, but I promise that's a live shot. I promise that is a live shot over there. And the thing to be aware of with this workflow, there's two real big caveats. One is that it is basically the best way to do it is with the phone app, and then you are limited to a 1080 workflow. And then on top of that, your network connectivity, your device connectivity is very, very important as well. If you have, it kind of gives me a little bitrate speed thing up here. If that's really low or not doing well, you might get some dropouts and things. So this is obviously a very freeing way of doing things. So you don't have to deal with any wires or anything like that, but you do have to keep in mind network connections. And then you do also need to keep in mind that you're going to be bumped down to a 1080 workflow. And of course, making sure your settings match is very important as well across your cameras. In a controlled environment like this, I can get away with auto white balance and auto exposure, but as you'll see in just a second, in my next setup, I was outside and I was filming under a tree that was kind of changing the lighting and changing the shadows a bit, and I left it on auto white balance. And since I couldn't control the environment, you will see the white balance shifting a little bit. So I should have done manual white balance outside. I didn't realize how much the lighting was changing. Very important to always be aware of those kinds of things. But the next way I can capture footage wirelessly, or I guess just independently, is just recording to the internal microSD cards of each camera. So I have a card in each camera, I have press record, I can just do a quick recording on my phone here, and you can see there's a red light that pops up when the camera is recording internally. And so each of these cameras is now just recording internally. And I actually do have the audio recording to all of them, so that way I can clap on screen and then sync that up. So this workflow, the internal memory card workflow, is great because you don't have to worry about connecting to a computer or anything. You just set up the cameras, press record. You can set the power button to just be the record button, and then you're all set. And this goes up to 2K. So we're not doing 1080, we're now doing 2K, which again in this video is actually being upscaled to 4K. But 2K is a pretty versatile format, and this is again just total independent. You don't need to deal with any kind of network connections. The downside to this workflow is that you have to sync all the footage, which is why it's important to do something like clap on screen, so that way I can match the visual of the clap with the audio spike and get all three of these cameras synced up. And since I've talked about all these different setups and thrown all this different info at you, I wanted to switch to this different, more teaching style setup, so that way I can kind of clear some of those things up. So right now I'm recording via USB just directly into the EMEET app on the computer. I'm not using OBS or anything like that, and just the camera's automatic settings. And I've got my main shot here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I've got my secondary angle here for any, additional points I want to make or emphasize. And I've got a third angle here for anything I want to show, which specifically in this case is actually this very handy little chart that I have put together. So since we have all these different ways of recording recording and sending signals with these cameras, I wanted to break down which resolutions work with which settings. And hopefully this kind of makes it as clear as possible. So we have different resolutions. We have 4K, 2K, and 1080. It's important to note though that we also do have 720, 480, and 360, not 360 degrees, but 360p. So you can also do 720 on all situations, and you can do 480 and 360 when recording to microSD. I honestly don't know why you would want to use those super low resolutions, but there might be workflows that demand it or that don't need the highest resolution, so they are there if you need them. But 1080, 2K, and 4K are probably the ones most people are going to be interested in. And then you have 3 ways of sending your signal. You can do it via USB, via the built-in microSD card, or of course wirelessly, just because these are wireless cameras. So if you want to do 1080, you can do that on anything. You can do 1080 over USB, you can do 1080 internally to the SD card, and you can do 1080 wirelessly using the phone app. If you want to do 2K, you are then limited to either USB or the internal SD card, and you can adjust the resolution in the EMEET app either on the phone or the desktop. And if you want 4K, the highest resolution, which is actually what I'm using right now, you can only do that over USB. So just kind of note whichever resolution you need, kind of depends on your workflow and the way that you want to record. So if you want to do things wirelessly, you are going to be limited to 1080. If you're willing to do USB, you can go all the way up to 4K. And it's important to note also that everything in the video you're watching is scaled up to 4K. So that means even when I was filming the 1080 wireless stuff outside and the 2K stuff internally, it's all being scaled up to 4K for this specific video just because it's all on a 4K timeline. So as awesome and wonderful as these cameras are, I do want to be clear that it does not mean I'm going to be throwing my Sony cameras into the trash or putting them up on eBay. They just serve different purposes. For a lifelong camera nerd who this is their full-time job, and I invested in these camera setups many years ago, it makes a lot of sense. And I do really love, the shallow depth of field, the cinematic image quality that you can get. And these budget-friendly webcams, I think, are an entirely different category and can serve an entirely different purpose. But even for someone like me in my workflow, sometimes I don't need all of that setup. I just need clear 4K, simple, or something super portable. So these can actually fit in my workflow pretty well also. So going back to my original question, can multicam setups be easy and affordable? And I think the answer is definitively yes. There's always going to be a level of tinkering. Even when you're using a simple camera, you're going to have to figure out your recording software, your audio, how you want to mix the cameras together and that sort of thing. But once you have that dialed in, especially using really simple free tools like OBS or very user-friendly paid tools like Ecamm, once you dial it in, it's kind of set it and forget it after that. And you don't have to use matching cameras in a multicam setup, but it really does help when you start mixing in different brands and different image sensors and different image processing. Getting the cameras to match in a way that's not distracting can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. So if you're looking for the easiest thing to do, getting, multiple of the same camera or at least even the same brand where the image coloring and processing is at least very, very similar really does help. And that's really what piqued my interest about EMEET cameras in the first place when they originally reached out, because making that multicam workflow, especially where the average person can buy multiples of the same camera, get that really great matching image quality, and then kind of grow from there. Anything that makes that type of thing more accessible to more people, I think is really fantastic.